Welcome, and thank you for joining the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFES, in this discussion series on democratic resilience in Europe. IFES then is a non-profit, non-governmental organization that supports electoral processes, very broadly defined, across the world, and we have assisted elections in European countries since the fall of the Iron Curtain. This is the 23rd installment in our series. So far, we've covered issues from election administration to inclusion, cybersecurity, disinformation, targeting women in politics, abuse of state resources, and the role of the Russian government in European elections and democracy. If you've missed any of our previous discussions, you can find recordings on them on our YouTube channel. My colleague is putting a link to that in the chat right now. I'm Magnus Öhman. I'm the IFES Senior Political Finance Advisor, and I'm also Director of the IFES Europe Democracy Exchange in Prague, which is hosting this discussion. And this event is part of a larger USAID-funded program of democracy assistance with the goal of supporting leadership that champions democratic practices and is made possible through the generous support of the American people. So today we're talking about the challenges faced by women in seeking to get engaged in electoral politics in European countries. With only 31% of women in European parliaments and with a share of women in parliaments in Central Eastern Europe being below that of Sub-Saharan Africa, there is a long way to go yet before European parliaments benefit from gender equality. And the situation is then even worse in many countries and local government bodies. So this online discussion will engage women politicians and experts on how they perceive the obstacles that exist to the political participation of women and how these can be overcome. We'll hear from women who have successfully participated in electoral politics about their experiences, and also from experts who support the participation of women in elections in different countries. So with us today, we have Lolita Cigane, who is former Member of Parliament and Parliamentary Committee Chair in her native Latvia. Lolita is also an expert on parliamentarism, lawmaking and political finance, and a former chair of Transparency International in Latvia. We have Liljiana Popovska, also a former Member of Parliament, in this case in North Macedonia, and also a former Parliamentary Committee Chair, in this case, the Parliamentary Committee for Equal Opportunity of Women and Men. And we have Matjošaitytė, until recently Chair of the Central Election Commission of Lithuania, and Regina Waugh, Senior Global Gender Advisor at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES. Unfortunately, Markéta Pekarová-Adamová, who is Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies of the Parliamentary in the Czech Republic, leader of Top 09, is unable to be with us in this online discussion. After we talked to our experienced panelists, we'll open for questions and for comments. If you have any questions, you can already now type those in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So let me ask the first question to Regina Waugh, Senior Global Gender Advisor at IFES. The title for this discussion includes the concept of ambition gap. What does that mean?
Sure. So good day, everyone, and thank you so much, Magnus. So first, I think I'd like to put a little bit of an air quotes around the ambition gap phrase, right? In part because I think, theoretically, this is referring to some research, at least in this context, that the Brookings Institution has done, basically about why women in the US have been less interested in participating in electoral politics than men have historically. And I think, not to take up too much time, but just to flag, this comes from this citizen political ambition study that Brookings has run over the last 20 years or so. It's basically saying that they surveyed about 4,000 potential candidates in the United States. And I think this data, and I'm sure we'll have this conversation, probably holds true, at least broadly in other places. But they found that these were potential candidates, people who had, the right kind of background for running for electoral office. And they basically found that of this equally matched sample of men and women, 60% of the men surveyed had considered running for office, whereas 60% of the women had not. And I think importantly, men were 2/3 more likely than women to have been encouraged to run for elected office by a party official or a political activist or an elected official. And then they were also 40% more likely to receive that suggestion to run from a colleague, a spouse, or a family member. So basically, we've seen, at least through this study, right, that we broadly operate in a world where people see men as candidates and men also report seeing themselves that way. So when we're talking about an ambition gap, there's a lot of reasons why that might be the case, but it does seem to be one of those barriers that we see in women seeking and participating in political and elected office. So I'll stop there because I know this is the first question. We have a long discussion, but that's, I think, the frame that I've been thinking about when hearing this phrase.
Thank you very much, Regina. And if we're then thinking about a situation where men are perceived as potential candidates and women are not, I'll turn to Laura Matjošaitytė, until recently chair of the Central Election Commission. Does this mirror your experience when you see women and men running or considering running for office?
Yeah, actually a very good question. And sometimes I think we have such a problem in Lithuania, or we don't have. Because right now we have our prime minister, our speaker of the parliament, women. So we had our president, Dalia Grybauskaitė, women. Also, we had times when our president, minister of foreign of defense, and who else? Of course, speaker of the parliament were women. So sometimes I feel confused. I don't know, we have such a problem or not. But I see there is a substantial gender gap in political ambition, and men tend to have it and women don't. And gender gap in political ambition is driven largely by women's greater aversion to campaigning, lower levels in political recruitment and traditional family arrangements, and also responsibilities. So I agree with Regina completely, and it's noteworthy, of course, that women's participation in political and public decision making has globally increased in Europe, for example, in Council of Europe member states in the past decades. But however, they still represent a rather homogeneous group, women from underrepresented groups, including young women, also women with disabilities, LGBTI women, and Roma women are less visible and have less access to leadership positions. And yeah, as my colleague mentioned, the ambition gap has a considerable influence here, with women underestimating their abilities and chances for success. It makes them less likely than men to even consider seeking public office, or to have political professionals encourage them to run. And here's the problem: women do not trust their abilities, knowledge, and competences, believes that men can do many things better. So we have a problem. We should solve the problem.
Thank you very much, Laura. And I'll turn to Lolita Cigane next, former member of parliament and parliamentary committee chair in Latvia. Lolita, we've been talking about the ambition gap. There are, of course, a lot of different factors involved. What would you say were the main barriers that you faced when you became involved in elected politics?
Thank you so much, Magnus. I'm very glad to participate in this discussion, a very timely and really a very appropriate topic to be discussed. So I would say that indeed I agree to the stance that in general, it is perceived that men running for an office is a norm, whereas women running for an office is an exception. And I have faced it myself. I was an elected politician for 8 years. I competed successfully in 3 elections. And during the time when I was considered to be new and fresh as an exception, I was getting a lot of positive attention. Whereas it was when it was the second and the third time, I was getting a lot of criticism. And this is where I felt that also the Latvian electoral system, unfortunately, comes into a mix with its unique features. Because one of the unique features of the Latvian electoral system is that we have a fully preferential system. So basically every voter can express a full preference for each of the candidates. And there have been several studies recently that actually show that women who are with a high level name recognition in Latvia, they get a lot of approval, but also a lot of disapproval. So basically in Latvia, the tendency that we have is that, yes, when women are a novelty, they usually receive quite a lot of publicity, and that's positive. But as long as they've served for a longer time, people start feeling disappointed. And some level of disappointment is natural in every politics, and I think in Central and East European politics, definitely, because the electorate is volatile, and there is very often this expectation that it will take one click or one perfect person to be elected and everything will be made all right. And specifically, Magnus, since you asked about my own political experience, when I came into politics, as you mentioned, I came as a fresh anti-corruption activist. So I was the head of Transparency International. And of course, it gave me the reputation as an anti-corruption fighter, as the fair fighter for the goods, for the people. After the second election, this image was much more diluted because when you practice politics, of course, you have to make compromises. Of course, you are perceived as representing the ruling coalition. So you are not this fairy tale princess anymore. And I did face it during my political career. So this is why I think this partly explains why there is indeed this tendency that women come into politics, stay for some time, and then leave, because it's just either too difficult to get re-elected. So those exceptions of women holding an office for a long time are really remarkable, and I think they would definitely require a closer study.
Thank you very much, Lolita. And let's continue with the practical experience of women being involved in politics. Turning to Liljiana Popovska, also then a former member of parliament and parliamentary committee chair. Let me simply ask, we've heard from Lolita's experience, and we heard from Regina and Laura. What were the barriers that you faced in your political career?
Thank you for the question, Magnus. I have been really a lot of time in politics in parliament. I have been 18 years in the parliament, before that in local government and in other positions also in government. So I really can talk a lot about experience in running for a position and also staying in position. So sometimes you are in part of the government, sometimes you are part of opposition. But what is important is that always you can find a way to reach the goals when you are in one or another position. It's easier when you are in government, but also it's possible when you are in opposition, then you make another coalitions and you fight on another way. Speaking about the barriers in politics, I would say there are two main type of barriers: objective and subjective. Objectively, we still live in a man's world, and politics is definitely the man's world where the men are ruling, and they don't want to give up like that and to let us as women in. So the women have to fight for the position in politics. That's one thing. Another approach is that subjective approach that I mentioned, because the politics is not the place where the women feels comfortable enough, because the politics is all about power, all about showing power, demonstrating power, and possibility to give concrete results. And especially because the politics is created by men, it is created according to men's standard. So, for example, when you are running the office, you have to have campaigns, you have to speak in front of a lot of people, and all this is a problem for a woman. Why? Because when man speaks in front of many people, he is bigger, taller usually, and with stronger voice, and he is perceived as something normal. A man speaking in front of a lot of people. When women come to speak in front of many people, our voices are weaker, our look is different. So we do look weaker on first sight, and it is very difficult to make a balance. From one side, not to lose your feminine side, and from another side, to send strong messages. So finding this balance is also one very, very difficult barrier, and you have to learn it through a lot of experience through the years.
Thank you very much, Liljiana. We've spoken now about different challenges and barriers that women face in politics, an example of those. Let's move on to exploring different and various angles of these barriers. And my first question on that would be to Laura. You were until recently chair of the Central Election Commission in Lithuania. You're now active as a lawyer, as you've been for many years. I wanted to hear from your perspective, how do the challenges that women face in running for elected office vary from those that women face in public administration and in the private sector?
Thank you, Magnus, for the question. Very good question. And women in elected positions actually face incomparably greater challenges than women working in private or public sector. I was a chairwoman. I worked in a private sector, so I can compare. And women in elected positions, even with the necessary education, competence, skills, knowledge, everything, have to prove every day that they can make critical decisions, important decisions, and take responsibility. They receive more criticism, as was mentioned, although sometimes it is unjustified. And women in political positions, elected positions, also often face increased publicity, which in the social space often manifests itself in disinformation campaigns, hate speech. And for example, if you're a board member or if you're just a lawyer and joins a company, nobody cares who you are, what you do, how do you do, or which clothes do you wear. But if you work as a, for example, member of the parliament or other elected person, so everybody wants just to look at you and just ask you, why do you do this? Why you have done this and this? So, and another thing, women in public office, in my opinion, lose more of the privacy. And for example, if you work in a private sector, you have your let's say, whole privacy. And right now, when you work as a member of the parliament or in a municipal council, you will lose a part of your privacy. And of course, it is not uncommon for women in elected positions to receive lower salary than they would receive while working in the public or private sector. So there are many challenges if we compare these things.
Thank you very much, Laura. I have a question next to Lolita. Lolita, you were talking about when you first ran for parliament and then the second and the third time. There is this idea that it is different or harder for women to remain active in politics than it is for men. Would you agree with that? And how would that work?
Oh, I would totally agree to that. Because obviously many women do have political ambitions, and that is wonderful. And I think in general, to start with, interest and ambition to work in politics is probably equally distributed. I think as many young women as many young men want to be politicians. It's just when thinking and rationale sets in, this is where women are filtered out. And this thinking and rationale sets in specifically because of the reasons that our colleagues have already mentioned, I think so appropriately. Both Laura and Liljiana mentioned that politics is a very brutal environment. That is an environment that basically is ruled by men's vision of the world. And at some point, many women, after some terms in the office, start questioning whether they really want to remain there in this rather brutal environment, because it always comes at a cost. It comes at the cost of privacy, personal privacy, because you feel very, very exposed. And that was definitely my feeling during the 8 years of my parliamentary mandate. I felt very publicly exposed and rather limited in my personal choices and freedoms in terms of how I would appear to the members of society. Then also, of course, you have limited time for your family and also developing your hobbies and so on. So it is very natural, after some time of fulfilling that ambition of service, of political service, that women start having a reflection whether this is where I want my life to be. And I think somehow politics sits much more comfortably with men because sometimes I've seen that there is not such a deep reflection in terms of how am I contributing? Am I really responding to the problems of the society? Is it all right to hear one and the same problems over and over and over again? In our region, obviously, things like social inequality, income gap, regional inequality in terms of development, they are not resolved overnight. So basically, I feel that at some point, it's really becoming to grind you after you've been in politics for a longer time. And somehow I felt that in our different roles as mothers, daughters, wives, somehow women are probably more susceptible to these pressures and exactly starting to question, how do I contribute? So after some time of being in public office, I think that is a rather natural choice for many women to either go into the private sector, as Laura mentioned, or do some international work. And there I can really also share my personal experience that after I stopped being a member of parliament and I really managed to get somehow to get the politics out of my system, so to say, I realized that I'm just so much more free and so much more personally on daily basis happy and content with being both in private business and also international work. So I think unless there are serious changes in political culture, in political parties, and also in acceptance of women, we will see this gap. And for us as a Baltic country, of course, a wonderful example is both prime ministers, women prime ministers in Estonia and Lithuania, our neighboring countries, and also some very visible and very convincing women politicians in the Scandinavian countries. And this is really something that is helping to normalize the role of women in politics. And I see that it's especially appealing for younger generation women.
Thank you very much, Lolita. And it's very interesting to hear you talk about normalizing the role of women. You talked about political culture. And I also heard you mention that politics sits more comfortable for men, which I think is an excellent example of showing how the political process is adjusted to what we can perceive as the reality of men rather than the reality of women. Thank you very much for that. Let's move. I have a question for Liljiana, because it's important that we see politics, and electoral politics is, of course, not just being elected to parliament. There's something that happens after that. You've been a chair of the Parliamentary Committee for Gender Equality of Women and Men. I wanted to hear, Liljiana, your experience in how women and men chair parliamentary committees?
This is a very interesting question. I think there is a very big difference in the way how do men and women chair the committees. According to my experience from my chairing the Committee for Equal Opportunities of Men and Women that I was chaired for 8 years, I find that women are tending to make consensus. And women don't like to voting with majority too much, but consensus is something that we prefer. And that means very long debates, very fruitful debates, and finding compromise solutions that are good for everybody, and finally voting with consensus. Another thing that is different is that women are not tired of many contacts during chairing the committee. And that's why I involved, for example, as much subjects as possible. NGOs, experts, interest groups, and all kinds of groups and people that are connected with some law that we were debating on. So that would be the second difference. The third difference would be that women as a chair are usually cooperating with representatives from the other political parties. And to find a consensus finally, it's normal that firstly I had to make contacts, to debate the proposals and to find the common solutions, and to debate also and negotiate with the government if the government is proposing the law, or if some interest group is proposing, to negotiate with that group to finally reach a consensus. So this process of negotiating is also something that we as women chairs are used to, and we like to do this. I used to do this all these 8 years. I was never tired. And finally, I believe that as women chairs of the committees, we contribute to the social cohesion, even through this way of working in the parliament and in the committee especially.
Thank you very much for that, Liljiana. My next question is to Regina. So, Regina, we've heard experiences of women in politics in Lithuania and Latvia and North Macedonia. How specific is this to the individual contexts, and how much can we generalize the experiences and the barriers of women in politics?
I mean, I think we've heard just in this discussion here a significant amount of commonality in terms of the challenges. I think I would, and as somebody who kind of is looking at these issues globally and is talking often to women in all different parts of the world, a lot of these points that our colleagues have raised absolutely they hold true across many multiple different contexts. I think it's interesting, one, that we do see some political systems and some electoral systems that may favor the newcomers coming into politics in ways that others don't. So when we're looking at things like first past the post, that tends to be a harder electoral system for women to get in. I think we heard the example of Latvia and the ways in which that women are elected, or that people are elected to political office, that may be favoring kind of the novelty of somebody new. But one of the things that I do think is interesting about the points that all of our colleagues have raised, and this is something that we do see, I think, around the world. I think you gave us some statistics about the levels of representation of women in European parliaments. That number is actually higher than the global average, right? Globally, we're at like 26% of national parliaments are women. And that's doubling from, I think, the year 2000. I think, in the year 2000, we were at 13%. So we're getting there, but, we're not at parity. We're not really close to parity. And I think one of the things that we'll start to see happening if we get to that 50% representation, where we're starting to see women represented in electoral bodies at the same proportion that they're represented in broader society, is that you actually see kind of a diversity of women coming into these spaces and not necessarily feeling like they are being seen as representing every single woman in their country or in their constituency, but also feeling like they may be able to kind of chart their own quite individual path. And as much as I think we see politics very much defined by, and I think we've heard this from all of our colleagues, kind of these masculine rules of the game. I think, you know, if we look closely at the way that men campaign, they have individual differences, and they're not necessarily seen to be speaking for all men every time they open their mouths and participate in political life. And I think often, because women are still enough of a numerical minority, you know, I think we heard from our colleagues, you know, this kind of fairy princess, you know, anomaly, this notion that women, you know, are perhaps less corrupt, less corruptible. The more we see more women in political spaces, I think just the novelty, I think, as we've heard, maybe perhaps wears off, but also we start to see that women are people, and that they're going to operate in political spaces in the same way that men do, if given an opportunity to elect, you know, amass power and be able to build these political spaces. And so I think in many places around the world, including in the United States, including in, you know, the countries that we're talking about, and particularly in places where women are even less represented in political and public life, you know, we're still, it still feels very much like women are the exception rather than the rule, which I think we've heard. And if we're still defining the rule by how men behave, then I think every time we see a woman, you know, behaving a bit differently, that is going to attract attention. And you know, I do think what we have heard over and over again, you know, across you know, political science literature and other things, women in leadership roles do tend to lead differently, right? They tend to lead by consensus, as our colleague said. Part of that, I think, is necessity, but part of it is just the way we are socialized often to want to make sure we're hearing from a variety of voices, make sure that we're building solutions that work for everybody. Women tend to be motivated by broader, you know, social equality goals when getting into office, which I think we've also heard from our colleagues in this discussion. And so being able to advance those goals, does take a long time, and it also requires bringing in kind of a diversity of opinions, and women as a minority sector are often much more likely to be seeking out that diversity of opinion as well. So there's lots more I could say about this, but I think I'll stop there, and we can you know, bring up these themes as we continue to talk.
Thank you very much, Regina, and thank you for emphasizing that women and men are obviously not coherent groups, that are all men are the same and all women are the same. It's a very important point. Let's move now from the barriers, the challenges that women face in politics, to the solutions. And I'll ask the first question to Laura, which is simply, we've identified the barriers that women face. Simple question, how do we overcome these barriers?
Of course, there are many measures. We can talk about quotas. We can talk about trainings and other things. So, for example, we should think about gender sensitive training programs. Of course, I mentioned quotas, but quotas can be just a starting point for change. In some countries we have quotas, but we have also the problem with women representation. So maybe we should find here another solution. For example, in some countries we can find such a decision where, for example, if you want to get a state donation, you should have in your party list, candidate list, such a number of women candidates. So maybe here could be a solution, I guess.
Thank you very much, Laura. And I want to ask a question to Liljiana. So your experience having engaged in politics for a long time. One issue that's often raised, and we've touched upon it here a number of times, is the role of men in supporting increased gender equality and increased participation of women in politics. How do you see the role of men in this issue?
Well, we definitely cannot do anything without men. The world is consists of men and women, and we should live together as in nature, also in the social life and in politics. So when we fight as women, when we fight for rights of women, for more women in politics, we don't think that we have to change the men's world for the women's world. We just want to be equal and to share the power, to share the experience, and to share our service to the citizens. So if I speak about my experience, definitely I wouldn't succeed without the support of men, especially at the beginning of my political career, because the leaders of the party, the centric party where I was half of my political life, let's say, in fact, they supported my growing in politics. They gave me chance. They believed in me that I can do something for the party, for the ideas that we were sharing. And that's why without their support of the leadership that was by men, I couldn't do that. So they supported me also when I proposed, for example, creating the first women's forum in a political party in Macedonia. So that was a new thing. Then another political parties were following this example. Also, this men leadership supported me when I initiated, together with another women from NGO sector, from governmental sector, forming a white women network, Macedonian Women's Lobby, we called it. And we initiated this to make more women in politics. So I got complete support by men's leadership. Without that, I wouldn't be able to be politician and to initiate this network, and also to be a coordinator of this network for 6 years. So this network was crucial for fighting for women's rights and for more women in politics, by for the first time introducing gender quota and then upgrading the way of how this gender quotas were developing. So the men's were really very important, especially in this first stage of my political life. So later, when I initiated creating another party, Green Party, that I was leading for 3 mandates, I tried to do my best to introduce as much men in political party as women, and that was something that we insisted on as a party, because, as I mentioned, the story is not to change one situation for another that is not complete. So definitely we need each other, and if we want to be fair, all the laws, electoral laws with gender quotas that we have introduced as Macedonian parliamentarians through the years, all they were voted by majority. To reach majority, we needed men and women, both. So lobbying to men and their support was crucial for getting more power for women in politics.
Thank you very much for that, Liljiana. And I want to ask another question to Regina here. One issue that we have touched upon, but only briefly, is disinformation and hate speech against women in the political area. What can and should be done to fight against this?
So I mean, that is a huge issue, and I know this series has had kind of quite specific discussions about the gendered elements of online disinformation in particular and hate speech. But it is one of those areas where we need there to be allies from kind of across the board, including, I think, men speaking up when they're seeing these types of attacks online. I think one of the things that's particularly challenging about social media is the things going viral and the virality at which and the speed at which these messages can tend to get disseminated. And because the types of disinformation that targets women politicians tends to be the type that gets the most attention, it tends to go viral at a faster rate and at a higher rate. So it's one of those things that we all have to be prepared to push back against. So there's a few things that I think we can do. Kind of at the highest, broadest level is, when we're looking at legislation around disinformation, around violence against women in politics, around regulating these online spaces, treating hate speech in this context as a particular form of gender-based violence is an important thing that needs to be considered as part of regulatory and kind of criminal codes. And we're starting to see more violence against women in politics laws, on the books in a number of countries. That needs to include kind of hate speech and online violence. So thinking about this at kind of the highest level, at the legislative and regulatory level, that's one thing. I think preparing all politicians and all people entering public life and public space about what they can do to kind of safeguard and protect their own accounts and to kind of keep some of these attacks from being less likely to kind of infiltrate. And that's, I suspect, less about disinformation and more about other types of online violence. We're thinking about things like doxing and some of these kind of security issues. Those are some real things that we can provide that type of technical assistance to new candidates in particular. And then, the way that we start to teach younger people how to engage civically and politically, a big part of that is now happening online. And we need to be able to provide that type of civic education and civic engagement training so that young people, men and women, are prepared to identify disinformation and also, understand how to push back against it when they see it online, so that there are not just young women, speaking up. There are also young men speaking up and putting a stop to these and saying, hey, I'm not going to forward this because this is not relevant to the conversation. It's also likely not true and not real. And so being able to teach younger people how to make those distinctions when they're looking at information, and making sure that everyone is prepared. And I do think that male allies are incredibly important here to push back against their own colleagues in perpetuating this, and also to be able to be there to be upstanders for women in politics as well. And just to go back very quickly to the original question about kind of bringing men into these discussions, I think it's incredibly important. We're talking about gender equality. That means both men and women, and one of the things that I think we need to do a better job as a global community is helping men understand that they have a role and a responsibility in achieving gender equality, right? Because that benefits all of us. And so being able to make that case and bringing along men, not just in the online space, but across the board. And then I think also, there are things that we can be doing, to make sure that when this type of disinformation is actually being targeted at women candidates by male candidates and by, in the course of political campaigning, that there are actual penalties and very real disincentives for other politicians from engaging in this behavior. And we've seen some successful examples of that in Latin America. I think has a number of interesting models for pushing back against that and making it really unappealing to engage in this type of misinformation. That I think is what we're gonna need to have out there to put that disincentive and accountability in place.
Thank you very much, Regina. Another factor here that I know you, Lolita, have been thinking about is the role of political parties in gender equality in politics. What can parties do? What should parties do to help women to run for office, the same issue as men?
I actually think that the issue of quotas is something that really is worth considering. And very interestingly, gender quotas, they are not only something that is being implemented in less developed countries upon international recommendations, as we sometimes think. I just recently worked both in France and Italy, and they actually have gender quotas for their candidate lists. And I think it brings in a very healthy balance, a very healthy consideration. And there it's really perceived as just a normality, a normal thing to have equal distribution among the candidates. And this really draws on the organizational culture of political parties in our Central and East European region, because my observation is such that there are some political parties which will always have almost half of women candidates, and then there are political parties which have some decorative women candidates are not expected to really play any more serious roles when it comes to the public policy making. So somehow I feel that this mandatory legal requirements of having quotas is actually equalizing out this political culture and giving more chance for change in those political parties where political culture is more close towards women candidates. And this really is not only a feature of our region, it is very visible that also both in Italy and France, there are political parties which are just having more difficulties to get women candidates, and in France, some of them even paid penalties for that. They were fined for not fielding enough candidates, and some of those were really long-established political parties. So this is very indicative of this closed political culture. Of course, it's always wonderful that there is this opportunity to create new organizations and to have new entrants into the political spectrum, and I think that Liljiana's example in that is really wonderful, that you've managed to create several, at least from what I heard, at least 2 political parties, or you joined one which was open to women, and you created your own which was open to both men and women. And in that respect, you could bring this organizational culture with you of more openness. Of course, other countries probably are not necessarily all that blessed with this ability to really create new sustainable organizations that bring in this new political culture with them. And in those settings, we have to rely to the already established political parties. And for instance, in my country, Latvia, the participation, general public participation in political parties is very low. So there is only that much politically engaged people who would want to join and establish a new party. So very often we have to fall back on the structures that we already have. But for that reason, having legally mandated things like quotas would be very helpful. Looking at the statistics in Latvia, when it comes to the local elections, our candidacy rates between men and women are 70 to 30%. Somehow women in the regions, they just don't consider having a regional or municipal political career as an option. Somehow it doesn't fly with them. And there I think we would hugely benefit from having quotas, for instance.
Thank you very much, Lolita. And you're referring to Liljiana, so I'll turn to you, Liljiana, for the next question. We're moving into the last round of questions now, and we want to move from talking about the principles of solutions to practical examples of solutions to break down these barriers. We already heard some of them, including what Lolita was talking about. But Liljiana, what do you see as the main activities in supporting women's entering electoral politics?
The main activity was, in fact, using the gender quotas. Firstly, fighting for gender quotas, because they have to be introduced into our electoral system of Macedonia, and then using them, because we have to be educated how to use them, and we should educate the voters how to stimulate more women to join to political parties or as independent candidates and to be elected. So gender quotas are definitely for me the best mechanism to increase the number of women in politics, and I would agree completely with Lolita and Regina. And also, we as a country have a really excellent example of using gender quota. We started in 2002 using gender quota, and then upgraded it through few models. So when we started and this gender quota was organized and introduced with fighting of Macedonian women's lobby, the White Women's Network of women from different origin, as in different sense, as political sense, religious or ethnical sense, and women working together, crossing the borders, crossing the divisions, overcoming them, and fighting for common goal, for common cause. It brought a very good impact not only to the women in politics, but also to the whole Macedonian society, I believe. So these gender quotas were the key that we succeeded to increase the women in parliament from 3% to 41.6% at the moment, and Macedonia is on the 22nd position in the list of IPU. So it is really great among the leaders. Always we are among the leaders in top 20 positions on this in this sense. We also introduced these gender quotas to the local elections because we have a proportional system also there, and also the result was almost the same, not the same. It was more difficult to increase the number of women on local level, probably because on local level the strength of men is bigger, you know, and it is easier to influence to the society, to the local society, and not to let your place to women. And also where is the most difficult is to have more women on the top positions as mayors in a local government. Why? Because the mayor is somebody who really has a concrete power with his signature, with his pen in the hand. He is the negotiator. He is somebody who is doing things, and who is proposing things, who is elected directly, and that's why the mayors is mainly men, and it was very, very difficult to enter there. And why? Also because for mayors we don't have gender quotas, and we as women movement are fighting for years, for decades, to introduce gender quotas in this sense. Me personally, and together with the party that I was leading, we proposed the law for introducing the gender quota for election of the mayors, but that was not accepted by any party. All the parties found some excuses and didn't want to do that, because the power, the main power on local level is here, and also it is connected with the members, women members in the government. And I would add, I'm sorry to be a little wider, what else besides the gender quota is part of the solution to cross the barrier, or to just to break the barriers. Women's solidarity and women's cooperation and women's support of each other. That is crucial. The women's network, Macedonian Women's Lobby, was crucial that we succeeded to do all this. That was established 22 years ago in 2000. Without that, we wouldn't succeed. On this way, we became friends, we became co-fighters, we trusted to each other. And that was creating a circle of trust, network of trust, network for support. That was crucial for finding candidates. We were trying to find candidates in each political party to stimulate them to run for office and to support them behind the scene. The party leaders, men, didn't like it all the time. But anyway, they have to accept, because the women are very efficient when they run for office. They get a lot of votes. And the final thing in the mechanisms how to cross the barriers is finding mechanism to combat hate speech. Regina was talking a lot of that. Lolita mentioned also, and Laura. So hate speech against women is the main barrier for women to enter politics and to stay longer. It is something that really is important to fight away, how to do against it. And again, women's solidarity in the parliament many times helped us as women in the parliament to survive, psychologically to survive the attacks. They were out of principles, that were out of humanity, but women's support helped us to stay normal and to stay in politics. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a long list of activities already. Gender quotas, educating the voters, engaging women also at a local political level as mayors, women's solidarity and networking, and addressing hate speech. Lolita, I'll go back to you. What do you want to add here? Activities that are needed and can help in reducing the barriers for women's political participation?
I think one very interesting aspect of this is that it is very important for women politicians to move beyond the general perception that women are in politics for fighting for specific women issues. And this was also mentioned by Regina in the beginning, where we do have women being an exception in politics. Women are perceived as the representatives of the whole group of women. And the more we have, so to say, normalization of this role, women having offices, high offices in economics, in finance, in energy issues, and so on and so forth, the more we will broaden the spectrum and acceptance of women in politics. And I think then a lot of women will see more clearly that they also have a path into politics. And this will also probably diminish the pressures from of the hate speech. Although I have to say that hate speech is something that's always been there. When I started my anti-corruption work as a civil society activist, that was the time when internet portals appeared and a lot of news were published on internet. And I very quickly learned not to ever open the comments section, because there was never anything good that was coming out of that comment section, and it was all ugly. So it's not a phenomena of recent years. It's always been there. For instance, during my tenure in Parliament, I had someone who was writing a handwritten hate letters to me, and I found out who that person is and wrote a letter of response. So we engaged in a dialogue. But it's a phenomenon that's always existed, and I really think that prosecution is very important. Public response, judicial response, is very important to cases where it's really hate speech and personal threats that really endanger this role. So yes, but just normalizing this role, I'm so delighted that we have this very visible women prime ministers now in the Northern European region, because this is showing that it's not only social welfare, culture, education issues that women work with. They actually now have the toughest portfolios in one of the toughest regions, given the geopolitical situation.
Thank you very much, Lolita. We are adding to the activities. Laura, I want to move over to you for basically the same question. What do you think are the solutions to the barriers that we've been talking about?
Yeah, of course, one of the solution can be quotas. We talked about quotas, and actually in Lithuania we had some time ago discussion about quotas. Maybe we need some quotas because we need more women in our parliament, in our politics, and etc. But there was no political will, and enhancing the participation of women from underrepresented groups in political and public decision-making requires a wealth of measures and a strong political will. And right now we have more than 20% women in our parliament. When we're talking about numbers, so it could be 131 members in the parliament and about 30 women from them. So it's not a huge number. Another, our colleague Liljiana mentioned about municipalities. So, for example, in Lithuania, from 60 municipalities, we have only 5 municipalities where women are mayors. So, yeah, it's not a huge number, but also we have our prime minister and speaker of the parliament. So it depends on the situation. But when we're talking about measures, yes, quotas, I saw one question about quotas, maybe quotas coming a bit too late. Yes and no. Sometimes it's better later than never. Of course, there should, when we're talking about measures, so I think there should also be resolute action to prevent and combat hate speech, sexism, and violence against women in politics, which affect their willingness to engage and to remain engaged in politics and public decision making. I mentioned training programs, also a necessary thing. There should be attention paid to the candidates' preparation, mentoring, support of women identified with potential and or desire to run. Not less significant is sharing experiences with other parties across countries and regions. Also, it is critical to provide training for female candidates in such skills as fundraising, message development, media relations, and communicating with voters. What else? Of course, train and promote women in campaign leadership positions. I mean, campaign management. So about these measures we should talk, but of course the list can be much more bigger.
It can definitely be a long list. Thank you very much, Lara. Regina, final question for you. What is IFES doing to support the participation of women in politics in Europe and indeed elsewhere?
Sure. So I'm so glad that Laura just mentioned the training and training for women in I think to take a leadership role in political parties, and also on things like fundraising. And Magnus, I know you've done a lot of work looking at campaign finance and the ways in which gender comes into play and who gets the support of their political parties financially, which is in fact a big factor in terms of how and whether women are going to be able to compete on equal footing. And so I think those are some of the things that we do at IFES, of course, is on the research side, taking a look at the gender aspects of those things. We do have a number of women's leadership programs, and we do work to provide that type of quite technical support through our She Leads programs and others to women around the world about how you think about running for office, but also just being prepared to take on a leadership role in your community and being a bigger part of the public discussion. So in some cases, we've actually worked to train women to participate in electoral management bodies and being part of election commissions. We also work with elections commissions to make sure that they're running gender equal elections, right? And being prepared to help make sure that women are able to come to the polls, and that all different types of women are able to participate in the political process that way. We've mentioned the importance of men being allies in this discussion, and so we often pair our women's leadership programming with male allies, training our Allies for Equality program, so that we're not just talking to women about how they can be better prepared to enter these fields. We're also helping to prepare the field to be a more friendly place for all kinds of different people and for women to participate, so that their contributions are welcomed and not cast aside and not set into these very specific roles and spaces. We're trying to make those conversations a place where everybody can participate, and I think being able to help bring along men as upstanders and as champions of their women colleagues and the women in their lives is a hugely important part of that. And so we try to couple our training and then the very kind of specific skills, making sure that women who are interested in participating as leaders are prepared, with skills like public speaking and negotiating and, mediating and being able to help, develop that type of consensus, so that when they're running as candidates, when they're taking on roles in public office, that they're best prepared to succeed in those spaces. So we do a lot of those things, both working to gender mainstream our systems, so that when we're doing our electoral support and other things that IFES is, I think, probably best known for, we're making sure that women are entering a more level playing field, and that women are taking on active roles at all parts of these institutions, and then also working with women leaders themselves, so that they're better prepared to seize these opportunities and to help create them as well within their communities. And then, of course, bringing along those male champions and allies who can help build that foundation as well. And then, of course, all the work that we do on disinformation, hate speech, etc. So the list truly does go on and on, but I think a lot of the work that IFES is doing in Europe and around the world is certainly trying to hit a lot of these key points that our colleagues have raised throughout this discussion.
Thank you very much, Regina. Thank you to all our panelists for the discussion so far. We'll turn over to the Q&A session. And if anyone have questions, type those in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And while you do that, I'm going to read out some questions that have come in so far. One question, and this is a topic that Liljiana referred to, has to do with local politics. So we mainly talked about women running for parliamentary office, but, and I'm reading now, what about subnational level of politics? Do the solutions to the barriers faced by women need to be different at different levels of electoral politics? Simply throw that out. Who wants to start? Liljiana, you want to go first?
Okay. The models for fighting for more women in politics is the same. We are using in Macedonia the same model in the parliament, for women in the parliament and women in local councils. And it is functional because it is proportional system. So it is according to some system of gender quotas that you are introducing into the list. But as I mentioned, the problem is with women as mayors. There are very few in our country, also very few, Laura. So definitely we need introducing gender quota in this system of electing. That's it. And also another thing, on local level, it is even more influential, the factor that is called money, finance. It is very interesting. Somebody would think, well, it is much more expensive to run for an office on national level, but not. If you are part of the party, it is easier to make to be compatible with the others in these campaigns. But on local level, it is even more crucial, more brutal to fight for position and to fight for visibility, and not only visibility, for decision of the voters for whom will vote. And there is an interesting thing here. I will finish with this. There is some kind of stereotype in small, especially small municipalities, that the people trust to those who are rich. And so this is also a weakness of women, because most of the money on local level is also in the men's hands. So this is something that should be discussed specially. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liljiana. Do any of our other panelists want to pick up on that issue? Lolita, please.
I will just briefly share the findings in terms of local politics that we had while I was in the parliament. Together with my assistant, we did a bit of structure of gender representation in leadership roles in our municipalities. And what we found was very interestingly that women tended to be, we don't have directly elected mayors, we have the chair people of councils, and women tended to be women of councils in very small municipalities. And as the municipalities got bigger, it was more dominated by men. And among seven biggest cities, there was no women chair of the council. So basically, small local politics somehow are conducive to women leadership, whereas bigger units with more resources, with more money are completely unconducive to women in politics. So this is also very interesting for us, because we just recently had a administrative reform, which basically reformed these small municipalities. So we have very, very few women chairwomen of the respective municipal councils. And there, I totally agree. Quota is the solution.
Thank you very much, Lolita. I want to move on to one other question that's come in. It's a very long question, but I think I'll pick one part of it, which we could probably talk about for another few hours. But I'm guessing this is within the context of binary and non-binary perceptions. The question is the concept of women and men an outdated idea? Who would like to pick up that question? Regina?
I'm happy to give it a shot, because it's something that I think about a lot. I have, as part of my portfolio, not just gender equality writ large, I also work on LGBTQI+ issues. And I do think about this a bit. The quota system has been so powerful in terms of getting men and, more women into politics, because there's been this set aside. But I think what we're also seeing is, and maybe particularly amongst younger generations, is that this binary concept of being a man or being a woman is less relevant, or resonates less with people, as we're all kind of discussing these things more and more. We've seen some very interesting, there have been some court cases. I think there's one in Mexico about, depending on how you identify, or is it enough that you identify as a woman to be able to take advantage of a woman's quota in elected office? And there are plenty of places, particularly indigenous cultures, where the concept of third gender, or not being binary, is part of the culture. And how do you protect that element while also putting into place these specific measures for women to help gain more parity in our elected systems? And so I think we're all kind of feeling our way through these things. And I think as right now, in many places, in most places perhaps, our structures are set up in this kind of very still binary world. We spend a lot of time talking about misogyny, which is a kind of a gendered term, patriarchy, which is a gendered term. But a lot of what we look at when we're talking about gender roles and the type of violence that we see against women in particular, also we see kind of perhaps compounded for people who are members of the LGBTQI+ community. And a lot of that has to do with whether or not a particular person is kind of fitting in to what we consider to be the proper role for a man or the proper role for a woman. So thinking about these kind of gender norms very holistically is, I think, at the crux of a lot of the violence that we see in our societies, targeting people who might appear to be different than what we've been talking about. So I think in order for these conversations to stay relevant, particularly for younger generations entering this space, this is something that we're going to need to continue to talk about, because I think it's a point well taken that there are more and more people who do not identify necessarily with being a man or being a woman. And as long as we're setting up our political system and these types of quotas, which have been such a powerful tool, we're going to need to figure out an opportunity to make sure that everybody can participate and has equal access to these processes, and that we're not inadvertently shutting out an important voice by making somebody choose how they're going to identify in these conversations.
Thank you very much, Regina. Laura, as you mentioned quotas, and as someone who was in charge of an institution who would have to implement these type of regulations, do you have a take on this issue?
As I mentioned, in our parliament, we had a discussion about quotas, and there was no political will, only proposal, and there was a discussion, maybe 30% of candidates should be women. And right now, we do not have such a decision, but if there would be written in our law, so we should solve the problem with somehow. It would be interesting just to see, but right now it's difficult to tell how it should be work how it should be working in practice.
Thank you very much, Laura. And we have a lot of questions, and we could go on this. I would like to go on, continue with this discussion for a very long time, but we do have come to the end of our time together. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank all of you for participating in this event. I again want to thank USAID for supporting this discussion, as well as my IFES colleagues. We'll now take a break over Christmas, and we'll be back with the next installment in this series in the late January, where we will focus on electoral justice. And I look forward to meeting all of you in that discussion. And until then, stay safe.